Okay, so the more we at the bottom of Daf Dalet on Aleph, and we just finished finding psukim to prove that lechatchila you need to shema by the shchita, by the Kabbalah, by the halacha, and by the zrika. And then the Gemara says, okay, now that we proved this by shinu chatos, if the shoichet or if any one of the other avodas were done with the kavanah for the wrong carbon, how do we know that shinu bailim has the same rule? So that we learned that if somebody by the shchita has in mind that the zrika should be done l'shem the wrong person, or if someone by the Kabbalah or the halacha has in mind that the zrika should be done on behalf of the wrong person, or by the zrika gufa, the kohen has in mind for the wrong person, that l'chatchila that doesn't work. How do you know that? So the Gemara first brought a rai. First, the Gemara wanted to say, okay, why don't you just learn it from shinuchatos? So the Gemara says you can't bring a raya from shinuchatos just with a mematinu, because the Gemara wanted to say that the pasuk says uvasar zevach toida shlamot. That tells you that the zvich has to be l'shem toida. We don't need a pasuk to tell you that the zvich has to be l'shem toida, because right at the top of the Amid, we already brought a raya from a makar v'zdama from zevach shlamot karban. The Gemara says me'ena inyan legufoi tneyu inyan l'shinui bailing. So the Gemara said maybe we should make a memetzinuk. You find that there's such a concept of the wrong kavanah by shinu kodesh. We find that there's the wrong, there's the issue of the wrong kavanah l'gabe shinu bailam. Maybe just like by shinu kodesh it applies to all four avodas, so too by shinu bailam it should refer to all four avodas. The Gemara told us no. There's four distinctions where shinu kodesh is more chomer than shinu bailam, and just because you know that it applies to all four avodas by shinu kodesh, lav dakfa would it apply to shinu bailam. Now, what are the four reasons? So that's what we were in the middle of learning yesterday, and the Gemara says, "Ikal mifrach." I'm at the third line from the bottom on Daf Dalet Amud Aleph. Ikal mifrach. There's four chumras that we could identify that exist by shinu kodesh and not by shinu bailam. Number one, mal shinu kodesh shegem psula begufa. The havamin of the Gemara is now that shinu kodesh impacts the carbon itself. You're making the carbon with the wrong kavanah, but shinu bailam leaves the carbon intact perfectly the way it is. All it's doing is having the wrong kavanah for the wrong bailam. That's not what we would consider a psul within the carbon itself. That's number one. Number two, the yeshtei ba'arba avodos, as we discussed, shinu kodesh. If you did the shchita shaloi l'shma, that's a problem of shinu kodesh. But if you did the shchita shaloi l'shem bailam, it doesn't matter. What matters is if you did the shchita so that the zrika should be done shaloi l'shem bailam. So therefore, the only avodah that really passes by shinu bailam is by zrika. So the yeshtei ba'arba avodos, shinu kodesh passes by any one of the four avodas. Masha Enkein Shinu Bailam. That's the second chomer of Shinu Kodesh. The third chomer is V'yeshne Lachar Misa. You can be Mishana, the kavanah of the carbon from Shlomim to Oila, if it's Lachar Misa Saval. However, you can't have kavanah for the wrong Bailam if it's Lachar Misa Saval, because there is no Bailam anymore. And V'yeshne B'tzibur Kibi Yochid. The psul of shinu chatos applies even by a korban tzibur, but the psul of shinu chatos of shinu bailam cannot apply by a korban tzibur, because no matter who you had in mind for, he was also part of Klal Yisrael. He was also part of Klal Yisrael that would be one of the bailam. You couldn't have shinu bailam. So therefore, we have four chumras that exist by shinu kodesh, but not the shinu bailam. Now let's just stop for 1 second and talk about the yeshna b'tzibur k'biyachid. Why by a carbon tzibur can you not have a shinu bailam? Masking whichever you have kavana for, he's one of the bailam. But what if the shaykhid hasn't zin for a guy? Correct Toisus, the last Toisus on Daf Dalam and Aleph. Yeshna b'tibur v'shenka b'shinu bailam. Im shachat l'shmoi hatomid hareyu bailam. If you shechted for anybody, it would be the bailam. V'afilu l'shem avoid ovid kechavim le'mifsal. Correct Toisus, what about if he shechted for shinu bailam for a goy? That wouldn't make a difference. The be'inon chaverei dumya didei mechuyev kapar kamoisai. A goy could bring a carbon, yes, but a goy never gets a kapar from a carbon, and therefore this is not called mina. He's too different. He's not part of the class that could be associated with this carbon. So even if the shaykhid shechted it l'shem goy, it's like if he shechted it l'shem chulin, like we had from Rab, the lav de mina loy mach. Zog to Gemara Vayter. We've identified 4 ways in which shinui chatos is more chomer than shinu bailam. However, in earnest, 2 of the kashas are not kashas at all. Zog to Gemara, ba'afal gav the tarti lav davka. Even though 2 of the chumras I can very easily slug up, but tarti mia davka. We still have 2 chumras. So therefore, you cannot learn shinui bailam from shinu kodesh. Which 2 kashas can we slug up? Number 1, Ma'ishna shinu bailam. Do I have a psula b'gufa? Shinu bailam you're claiming is not a psul in the gufa carbon. It's just a psul in who it's being allotted to. Why? Because machshava alma. But the problem is it's still only a machshava. It's not a psul in the actual carbon. Well, think about it. Shinu kodesh nami machshava ba'almahu. It's not really a psul in the gufa carbon. The avodah was done perfectly. It's only a kavana. That's not the gufa carbon. Ella, what are you going to have to say by shinu kodesh? Even the achshava posla, that the machshava has the power to make a psul, even though it's not in the gufa carbon. Well, then I could make the same argument by shinu bailam. Hachanami kiven the achshava posla. So we have diffused, we neutralized one of the 4 chumris, and then you have Ular Pinchas, Bereder of Mori. The Amar Yesh Shinu Bailam La'achar Misa, according to Pinchas, Bereder of Mori, who holds you could have a Shinu Bailam La'achar Misa, and I don't know how. We'll have to wait till we get to that sugya. But Tarti Mia Ikalamifrach. We still have 2 churmis that remain standing. A is it doesn't apply by a tzibur. Shinu Bailam wouldn't apply by a carbon tzibur. And B, Shinu Bailam only really exists by Zrika, not by all the other avoidance. So we're looking now from a core. We found a makar that the shchita has to be l'shem the right bailam, or the shchita has to be l'shem to do the zrika for the right bailam. What about the other 3 avodas? Halacha, Kabbalah, and zrika. El Amar Rav Ashi Amar Kra. The pasuk says v'nir tzaloi l'chaper lo. Let's see the pasuk inside. There's v'samach yadai al Reish ha'olah. So speaking about the carbon olah, v'nir tzaloi l'chaper lo. So loy. L'chaber olav, v'loy al chaver. So you have to have kavanah to be mechaber on the correct person, the owner of the carbon, not on the wrong person. So that gives us one more limud that Rashi says we're going to apply to this rika, because the nirtza is usually referring to this rika. So alma zrika l'shem bailam b'inyan. So now we've covered shchita and zrika. We still have to deal with halacha and kabbalah. Are you telling me that's what Venir Tzaloi L'Chapar Lov is to tell you? We need that pasuk to teach us another limud. L'chidetanya Venir Tzaloi L'Chapar Lov Rabbi Shimon Aimer Es She'elov Chayiv B'Chaviyusay Ve'She'enei Elov Enei Chayiv B'Chaviyusay. We know that if someone says Harei Alai Oila and something happens to the animal that he designates, he has to bring another animal. Alai, the chiyuv is on him. But if someone said Harei Zu Oila, the chiyuv wasn't put on him, and the animal went missing, he won't have to be memala. He won't have to provide another animal. The Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdima my timer, even the Amar Alai, if he said Harei Alai Oila, command the ton kasvei. It's as if he literally loaded it onto his shoulders, meaning this obligation rests upon his shoulders. Dummy. So it's still not a problem because Rab Ashi mi v'nir tzaloi l'chaper ka'amar. He could learn it from v'nir tzaloi l'chaper, and the alav is what tells us the halacha Allah is what tells us the halacha of Rebbitzak Baraktim. Okay, so we now have covered Zrika. Frank the Briskerov, a very simple question. Why do I need a special pasuk to tell me that a rare lie is a chiv on him and a rezu is a chiv on the animal? It's pasuk. That's what he said. A rare lie means he accepted upon himself. A rezu means he just made his animal kodesh. Why do we need a special pasuk to teach us this? So the Briskerov answers that you're mechuyev when you say a rare lie. That's pasuk. But the question is, does it create a shibut on your nechasim? From the pasuk you learn that it creates a shibut on your nechasim, and that even if you die, your children have to provide that animal. Now, what about Kabbalah? Kabbalah Minalam, how do we know that Kabbalah done with the Kabbalah do Zrika, L'Shem the wrong by them is an issue. If you want to say, well, you make a memetzinu. We know Zrika is a problem, Shlei L'Shem by them. We know Zrika is a problem, Shlei L'Shem by them. So maybe Kabbalah as well. There's a chumrah that Zvicha and Zrika have that are unique. And what is that? That if you did this b'chutz, we know shchut chutz leads to a chiyuv kares, but it only applies to Zvicha and Zrika. It does not apply to all avodas. So therefore, maybe dafka Zvicha and Zrika have the chumrah that it has to be done l'shem the right bailam, but maybe Kabbalah would not have to be done l'shem the right bailam. You know how we will learn Kabbalah? We will learn it from the ayil that the Nazir brings when he finishes his Naziris. He brings an ayil that is like a carbon shalom. We learned the es ha'ayil Yase Zevach Shalom. So from the Zevach Shalomim, he has to do it l'shem the right carbon. Shiteas Yosy l'shem Shalom. Now, once again, we don't need a pasuk to tell me that the avodas of the Shalomim have to be l'shem Shalomim, because we've already proven that. We're looking, so this is an extra limud. Therefore, Me'eno Inyan l'shinui kodesh the nafkalei mehasam teneu Inyan l'shinui bailam. So from the ayil, well, it's ayil yasas evach shalom, which really tells you shinui kodesh. Since that's an extra limud, will apply to shinu bailam. That's how we know that Kabbalah needs to be done l'shem the right bailam. Who said that that's how you read this pasuk? Ema yasa is klal. That's ayil yasa. Yasa has to be done. That's the klal. Zevach is a prat referring to the shechita only, and prat uchlal yasa klal zevach prat klal prat ein bechlal el ma'aseh beprat zvicha in midi achrin aloi. So from here, maybe we're only talking about this zvicha, not about the other avodas. Now, right away you can ask, which the Rishonim ask, is we don't need a pasuk for zvicha because we've already brought a pasuk for zvicha. So why don't you say me'ena inu zvicha teneu inyan leKabbalah? So there's a couple of different terutzim on it, but one of them is really the Gemara is going to answer a similar teretz to that anyway in a moment. So Dr. Gemara, iksev yasa shlomim zevach and not yasa zevach shlomim, then kidika amrit, because the real klal is not yasa by itself; it's yasa shlomim. That will be the klal. Do the shlomim l'shem the shlomim, and then zevach is going to be the prat to say it's only referring to the zvicha, but it doesn't say yasa shlomim zevach. It says yasa zevach shlomim, meaning the klal is split up. So only part of the klal, the word yasa, comes before the prat of zevach. Hashud eksiv yasa zevach shlomim have a klal she'enei molei. It's an incomplete klal. The whole klal she'enei molei. If you have an incomplete klal, ein don and oisoi b'chlal prat. So therefore, since it's not b'chlal prat, we'll just darshan yasa zevach shlomim to teach you that the shechita has to be l'shem shlomim, but me'inyin l'gufay t'neu inyin to the other avodas, and this is referring really to all avodas. Ravina Amar la'olam danin. you do darshan klal uprat. But this is not a klal uprat. This is a klal uprat klal. V'lashem chazer v'kolal. So it says there's ayel yasa zevach shlomim lashem. Lashem is a klal, and therefore you say it has to be ke'en prat. It has to be the voida. Amalei rabachim idivtil ravina. How could you say this is a klal prat klal? V'loy dami klal kama l'klal basra. The lashem is the klal basra. It's not doim at all to the klal kama, which is the asisa. Why is that? Klal marba asiyos v'suloi. The klal, the Reish, the first klal, v'asisa zavach. V'asisa means action, meaning the four avodas. But klal basra, kol Hashem. It's Lashem, anything that you do involving the carbon, even though it's not one of the official four avodas, it would still have this responsibility of Lashem. So it's a very different type of klal. It's much more inclusive. What avodas are not really the four avodas, but are auxiliary avodas? There's a mitzvah to spill the extra blood after this rika onto the Yisrael Mizbeach. Maybe that also has to be done Lishma. The actor say murid. So Zok to Gemara, nevertheless, it still is a klal pratu klal, because a ton of Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, the chaloli prati darish kahai gavna. We learned from the Dvei Rabbi Shmuel that even though the klal basra is not doimit to the klal kama, we would still dash into the klal pratu klal. Klal pratu klal iyata don elokena prat ma prat mefurish avoida uva inon lishma. It's an avoida that must be done lishma. Av kol avoida uva inon lishma. So now we have another makar that all of the avodas have to be on lishma, and we learn many in the gufay. It has to be l'shem, the right pipe. Pray to Gemara. What about this problem? Ima prat mefurish avoida v'chayavin oleh b'chutz. Av kol avoida v'chayavin oleh b'chutz. Because we know shchita, if you shecht a carbon b'chutz yechayv pares, and that applies to shchitu zrika, because they're the only two avodas that you chayv on b'chutz. Shchitu zrika in kabbalah v'ilachaloi. That's one thing that I could suggest, and therefore it's not including kabbalah. So we're back to square one. Inami ma prat mefurish davar haton tzafay. The prat, which is vicha, we know the shchita of a carbon has to be on the tzafan side of the mizbeach, and the yeshnei bechatois apnimiyos, and it applies to it applies, and it also the shchita is an avoda that you do by the chatois apnimiyos as well, right? Every carbon needs shchita. Therefore, maybe we could only be marba from there that it has to be l'shma av kol aton tzafon v'yeshnei bechatois apnimiyos, which would include shchita and kabbalah. But it wouldn't include zrika, because there's no zrikas dam on the mizbech achitzayin by chatois apnimiyos, and it doesn't need to be done with tzafay. So Gemara, true, but ikal meimer hachi, ikal meimer hachi. You have a klal prat klal, and you're not sure which way to darshan. Do you limit it only to things that are chayav nolei b'chutz, which would exclude kabbalah, only would include shchita and zrika? Or do you tell me that the klal prato klal is being memayit things that are not ton sofin and not the chatois apnimiyos? Now that would include shchita and kabbalah, but it wouldn't include zrika. It can go either way. So therefore, since a limit can go either way, we say shkulheim. We cannot exclude one over the other, and therefore v'yavayu shneim. And therefore, both halachas, everything is learned out of the klal prato klal. So therefore, we know shchita, we know zrika, we know kabbalah, and Rashi tells us whenever you know kabbalah, halacha goes together with kabbalah, like we learned yesterday. That since it expressed the lashon of halacha, lashon v'krivoi, we say that it includes by default everything that applies to kabbalah applies to halacha. Iba yisema, or I can have another teretz, which is really a repeat of the same teretz. Iba yisema, lishnach pida. I'm sorry, chada. Take a b'milsa, which means again each one is unique. There are achronim who discuss the nuances, the fine nuances of the difference between these two terutzim. Maybe chada is not learning it out of a klal prat klal; it makes it differently. But whatever the case is, it's basically the same thing. Since we don't know which way to go, do we go with shchita and zrika and exclude kabbalah, or do we go Shchita and Kabbalah and exclude Zrika? Since the Svara is equal in either direction, we say that the Klal, product Klal, will include both. Or Iba Yisema, let's say that the Zrika is not included. It's only Shchita and Kabbalah, because that applies to Chatayis Apnimius, that applies to Safin. But Zrika Midir Rashi Nafka, we still had the pasuk of Enir Tzaloi Lechaparala. So we have that extra pasuk anyway. Zrika Midir Rashi Nafka. Okay. So now we've proven from El Nazir that the Shchita, the Kabbalah, the Ilacha, and the Zrika all have to be L'Shem the right Bible. So we've covered all our bases, but we still have one problem. What was the whole Makar that these that all four avoiders are subject to the restriction of Shinu Bailam? We learned that out of El Nazir, and that was the whole pasuk we just brought from Ves Ha'ayil. Yeah, what was the lashon of pasuk? The Es Ha'ayil Yasa, Ves Ha'ayil Yasa Zevach Shlam. But that's not speaking about every carbon. That's only speaking about the El Nazir. Maybe the El Nazir is different. Ashkan El Nazir Shar Shlam Minala. And how do we know that this applies to our standard carbon Shlam? And if you want to say, well, it's a memetzinu, mal el nazir. No, I'm sorry. If you want to say you learn al nazir, like el nazir, you need to be lishma on these four avoiders. So too every other shlamim. I could say no. Maybe el nazir has a chumrah, and therefore only the el nazir has to be done lishma. Mal el nazir shken yesh imay damim acherim. The el nazir is not a carbon that comes on its own. There's other carbonas that come with it. There's an oil nachatas as well. So therefore, it's more chomer. But who said a regular shlamim that's not accompanied by other karbonos? Who said that also has these restrictions? Dr. Marcus im came nichtayv shlomov. My shlomim lerabos kol shlomim. So again, let's look at the lashon apostle. It says v'esayil yasa zavach shlomim lashem. It's mashma speaking about all shlomims in general. If it was only speaking about the shlomim that the Nazir brought, it should have said v'esayil yasa zavach shlomov. It's shlomim. It says any shlomim. So that tells me that this restriction applies to all four karbonos. So not to all karbonos, not only the El Nazir. Okay, so Ashkan Shlomim. But Shar Kol Kotchim Minol. We know that Lishma, the Shem Bailam has to be by a El Nazir, by a Shlomim, but how do you know it applies to an Oila? The Chidem and Elif Mishlomim, I could say Mal Shlomim, she came to Unen Smicha, Unesachim, it has three requirements that it has, and all the other karbonos Rashi says might require tnufa, but it doesn't require chavish chaz. It might require shmicha, but not tnufa. It might require one or the other, but no other carbon possesses all these three requirements. Al Amakra, we're going to find a hekesh that compares all karbonos to each other. It says Zois HaTorah la Oila la Mincha la Chatas la Asham. So this combines all of the karbonos and say they all have the same halacha. The kesher nakasav l'shlamim ma shlamim bein shinu kodesh bein shinu bailam ba'inan l'shma af kol bein shinu kodesh bein shinu bailam ba'inan l'shma. Now notice the Gemara is talking here about shinu kodesh as well. Because if you think about it, the same kasha that the Gemara asked here, maybe this only applies to a shlamim and not to other karbonos. Well, that you can ask on yesterday's Gemara, when the Gemara brought psukim to say that Shinu Kodesh is a problem, it was also brought from a Shlomah, right? It was all from Zevach Toida Shlomah. So how do you know it applies to Oila? So regardless, you need this hekesh to say, once we've discovered that by a Shlomim, all the avodas have to be Silas Shem Kodesh and Silas Shem Bailim, we can automatically apply that to all other karbonos. We're almost out of the woods, because we needed 4 limudim in each category. But now, frankly, why don't you say it's possible? If it was done against the instructions of the Torah, so it should be possible and ganzen. Why should it be possible and ganzen? Zogt Rashi, lifslu sharali nasu kil chason, veins rikason materes be bisar and lachila. If it's not done properly, so it should be possible. Now, Tosfos asks, of the obvious kasha, there's a rule by Kachim that things are only ma'akiv. If there's a requirement mentioned in the Torah regarding Kachim, there only be the Eved ma'akiv if the Torah repeats it. These halachas that we just learned We don't find two psukim to say the same thing. So why would you say it's possible just because it wasn't done properly? It wasn't v'hacha loy shina, as Tosfos says, it was not repeated. The Shloimer Zak Tosfos, the Parach Mishina Kodesh. So Tosfos has an interesting twist. Tosfos says maybe both these psukim, maybe don't say me'ena ina legufay tineyu inyan l'shinui bailim, because it is inyan legufay. You needed to say it twice, right? The whole basis of our Gemara that by shinu bailim we have a makar is because we have two makaris for shinu kodesh. Maybe use them both and say that it will be possible. Dr. Gemara Amar Krata Pasuk says, Moitza sfosecha tishmar vasisa kashanedarta. We darshan this right at the beginning of the Masechta, and then it says Moitza sfosecha tishmar vasisa kashanedarta lashem alekacha nedava. So the Gemara asks, is this a neder or nedava? What are we talking about? Hani nedava neder. Ella im kimashanedarta. If you have the right l'shem kodesh l'shem bailim. Im kamashanedarta siso ye neder. The original neder that you made will be fulfilled. V'mlav ye nedava. But if not, it'll be like a new carbon nedava, but a kosher carbon nedava. So you see from the pasuk that it's kosher. V'itzrich moitzas vasecha. You need a pasuk of moitzas vasecha to tell us this halacha. V'itzrich zois haTorah. We also need zois haTorah l'michal to tell us that this applies to everything. The ikaz of rachmana moitzas vasecha. If you only add the pasuk of moitzas vasecha, now turning on to the Hey Amaralef, tomorrow's daf, lo yoda b'mai kazav rachmana zois haTorah. The Torah makes a hekesh, but lagabi what halacha is the Torah making this hekesh? How do we know that the hekesh is lagabi the psul of shaloi l'shma? Therefore, kazav rachmana. Therefore, we need moitzas vasecha. Moitzas vasecha tells us it's got to be l'shma. Because of rachmana zois haTorah, but if you only add the pasuk of zois haTorah, I'm sorry, lo yad b'mai wouldn't know what the psul is. Therefore, because of rachmana zois haTorah, it tells us. So if it just said moitzas vasecha tishmor lo yadanim b'mai ka'amar, the like siv behedya b'hai kra avodas l'shma v'dim alav l'shlam l'shtoikra. Right? It says moitzas vasecha tishmor. What exactly are we talking about? So we need zois haTorah to tell us that we're referring to shlomim, and by shlomim we know it has to be l'shma because of the lemuda, because of rachmana zois haTorah. But if we only add the pasuk of zois haTorah, then havamina livsalu. Then maybe I would think it's mamish possible with the Ebed as well, like the Gemara just asked. To tell you that even though it's not a but it's still in the dava, it still is a kosher. Rami Reish Lakish. We keep on talking about different people asking questions and answering them. Now it's Reish Lakish's turn. But this was a unique way to ask a question. Rami Reish Lakish al ma'ayu be midrasha. He was lying on his stomach in the Bismedrash. Imagine if you want to like relax, you lie on the floor in the Bismedrash, and he asked. So there's talk in the version. Vasepes Reish Lakish was lying on the floor. The most positive shot is he wanted to show he's bachna, he's machni himself. He's bent down. So he asked the following shayla. Umakshi asked the following kasha. Im kisherim heim yirtu. If they're kosher, they should be meratza. V'im ein meratzin, and if they're not meratza, then lama boim. Right? The Mishnah says that if you had a kavanah of the wrong kavanah, the carbon is kosher. Ella shaloi alu l'bayim l'shem chayva. So they're not meratza. So Reish Lakish says, I don't understand. How could you split the two? If it's not meratza for the bailam, then it's not kosher. What does it mean the carbon's kosher, but it doesn't impact anything? It doesn't make sense. So Krashi Lamain Bain Vakati like Kamale time in the Mastis in the Afinim in Mitzvah Vasecha. Once you have the Xeris cause of a Mitzvah Vasecha, then you have to accept that it could be kosher but not meratza. But he didn't know about that possible. So therefore we asked in Ksher Mehem year 2, the Me'em Meratin Lama Bain. Amal Rabbi Lozer. Rabbi Lozer said, the gears had changed it to Rabbi Lozer because Rabbi Eliezer was a Tana, Rabbi Lozer is Namayra. Why are you so amazed at such a concept? We already know such a concept. Because Motzinu be'boyin lachamisa, karbonos that the children have to bring after the meats of their parents. Shein kesherin, they're kosher karbonos, but they ain't meratzin, they're surely not meratza, because as Rashi says, ain't kapar l'mesim. So you find already that concept that a carbon has to be brought, even though it will not accomplish its original intent. So these are the same. Why do you find it so strange? And where do you find that the boyin la'achamisa they're sharing ben meratzin? That none. Vayisha shahivia Chatasa, a woman who brought her chatas. We're talking about a yoledes umesa, and then she died, but she didn't bring her oila yet because a yoledes brings a chatas and an oila. The Lakish yaviu yarshin oilasa. Her yarshim could bring her oila. So this is an example of it's kosher, but it's not maratza. But if she brought a lasa umesa, but if she brought her oila but not her chatas, then lo yaviu yarshin chatasa, because that's called a chatas shemesu ba'ala, and that chatas goes lamisa. So Reish Lakish says, okay, you have an argument. I'll agree with you by an oila, Reish Lakish said, because you've illustrated that an oila can be brought la'achamisa. But an asham, which is also for an avera, remember in our Mishnah we had a machloikis between the Tanakama and I think of Yosy, and the Tanakama held that asham would be kosher. So an asham, the loy asi la'achamisa, if someone has a carbon asham when he dies, you never bring that asham, it's yirachi yistoyev. So, minol, how do you know that if it was shaloi lishma, how do you know that you would still bring it as an adult? Omer lei, so Rabbi Lazar answered back, I don't understand. Harei machlikoisecha bitzidoi. That's exactly what our Mishnah says. I'm sorry, Rabbi says Rabbi Lazar. In our Mishnah it says Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, afa asham is like a chatos. And in fact, you don't bring the asham. So Reish Lakish, Rabbi Eliezer, it's masking to you. You're asking an asham you don't bring for someone who died? No, that's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. So what's your problem? So Reish Lakish was very disappointed in Rabbi Eliezer. And he said, Amar, Zeu sha'arin alav adam gadalu. But Rabbi Eliezer is the person that people praise? I'm asking him from the Tanakama. You're bringing me from a Shittas Yochid, a Bar Plukta. Kamina no, Mishnah Shlema. I'm asking you from the Tanakama, from the main Mishnah, from the Stam Mishnah. Viat Amrit Li Rabbi Eliezer, and you're saying, okay, so my svara makes sense according to Rabbi Eliezer, but I'm asking according to the Tanakama that says the Asham is kosher, even though it's like you'll never find an example of an Asham that's brought where it's not Oil L'Baylam L'Shem Chayva. You know what? I'm going to have to do the heavy lifting myself. I'm going to have to answer my own kasha. I'm going to have to open the door for myself. And he brought a right from the pasuk of Moitzva Shvasecha Haydadav and Elu Kidoil. We have a pasuk. Einachanami. It's a shver ezach. How could you bring a carbon if it's not maratza? But we have exeris akasuv, and therefore we don't question. Yosef Reb Zera, Reb Yitzchak bar Abba, the Yosef Abaye Gabaye. So Reb Zera and Reb Yitzchak bar Abba were sitting, and they were visited by Abaye. The Yosef V'Ka'amri, and they were talking about this conversation that Reish Lakish had. Reish Lakish had a problem. Osham the loy asila achamisa, and the Gemara answered v'nosav lo talmuda moitzas fasech. Frag the Gemara. I don't understand. So Abaye asked, or they all asked. I don't understand what Reish Lakish was saying, because Ema haba b'neder u'b'nedava laisi v'loy lirtzi. Anything that you could normally bring as a neder or as a nedava, that you could bring and it won't be maratza. Maskim. But Osham loy laisi klal. But you shouldn't bring Osham at all. So moitzis vasecha was hisakash in the nedava. That only applies to korbanos that could be brought with the nedava. You could on your own bring an oil. You could on your own bring a shlamim. You can't on your own bring an Osham only if you did a chay. So maybe the pasuk of moitzis vasecha only applies to korbanos that could be brought as a nether, but a carbon that can't be brought as a nether, like a noshim. Who said that this applies? So your answer, Reish Lakish, was inadequate to answer your own kasha. Amalu Abaye, Reish Lakish mehacha. This is where Reish Lakish justifies it. It says in the Brayse, Pasach mehacha pasach. This is where Reish Lakish got his teretz. V'shachat oisa lechatos. There's a special gzeres akasav by a carbon chatos, and it says v'shachat oisa lechatos, oisa lishma kshera shaloi lishma psula. It's only the carbon chatos that if it was done lishma it's kosher, but if it was done shaloi lishma it's going to be possible. Hashar kochim, all other kochim, including asham, shaloi lishman will also be ksherin. Yochel yirtu, you might think they should be meratzer. Talmud Leimer moitzes vasecha. So therefore, Reish Lakish has a Gzeres HaKosov. There's a I mean, she's talking about a chatos is like a puzzle. A chatos is puzzle. But a asham, there's a special puzzle by chatos to tell you that this is an exclusive rule that applies to a chatos, but it wouldn't apply to an asham. So that takes care of Reish Lakish. Correct. Gemara be'ema hacha beneder v'nemer haba beneder unedava laisi v'leirti. The puzzle is moitzah sosecha vasisa kasher nedarti nedava. So what does that mean? That means the carbon is kosher, but it's not maratz, it's nedava, it's like a new carbon. So ve'ema hababa neder nedava laisi v'leirti. Maybe the puzzle is telling you that hababa neder nedava is laisi v'leirti. But asham, where we have a special deal from Oisa by Chatos to tell you that the Chatos is Pasha Shaloi Lishma, but the Asham is Kosher Shaloi Lishma, maybe Asham are Tuyunami Lirtzi. In other words, very simple. You do have a special Gzeres HaKosov to tell you that an Asham is not Pasha Shaloi Lishma, but that doesn't mean it automatically defaults into the same category of Moitis Fosecha Tishmar. It still doesn't fit in the Moitis Fosecha Tishmar. It's not a Davar Baba Nilava. So it's Nishti Nishteh. So it's interesting because that's going to make it more kludik. That's going to say that not only can you bring it, but it'll also be maratza because you don't have a pasuk to say that it's not maratza. Amar Abaye, Asham demirtzi loy matis amrit. You cannot say that an asham is going to be maratza. It's not a valued suggestion because kabachayim me'oila uma oila she'einu mechaperes einu maratza the oila, which doesn't have to accomplish so much. It's not being mechaper on a specific avera. Yet we still say that the Torah tells us it's not maratza. Yeah, but it's not mechaper on the avera. It's not a kapara, right? It's fulfilling your requirement to bring a carbon, but it's not a kapara. Asham shemechaper, an asham that has to create a kapara, that would require, if anything, more of a ritzui. Einoidin she'edim maratza, surely. If it can't even just fulfill your requirement of a nether, it surely cannot fulfill your requirement for a kapara. Zok Gemara, that's not a good color. Because mala oila shein kolel. Oila has a chomer. You know why oila is not maratza? Because oila, the whole thing is burnt, but an asham part of it is eaten, so it's not so chomer like an oila. So maybe the asham would work, even though it's not maratza. Zok Gemara, shlomim yachichu. Shlomim is not kolel, and it also has the rule that it's not oila ba'al shem chayv. Well, mal shlomim shekein ta'unim nesachin utnufus chazav v'shoik. Well, Zok Gemara, oila terchiach. Oila doesn't. The chazar adin loy roizeh karoizeh v'loy roizeh karoizeh. The oila and the shlomim each have their individual chumras, but they don't share the same chumrah. But they're both karbonos. Hasara shavish abahen shem kachim. They're both karbonos. And v'shachton shaloi l'shmon ksherin ve'in meratzin. And if they're shachton shaloi l'shmon, they'll be kosher, but they won't be meratzin for the Bible shem pleiva. So let's extend that to Asham as well. Afani Asham shu kodesh v'shachton shaloi l'shmon kosher ve'in meratzin. Zok tomorrow, no, you can't even learn it from Asham, from Shlomim and Oila combined. Because Mala Tzara Shavish Aben Shekin Yesh Noi B'Tzibur. You can have an Oila of a Tzibur, you can have a Shlomim of a Tzibur, but you can never have an Asham of a Tzibur. Zok Gemara, Toida Terchia. Well, you have a carbon Toida. Toida you never either have as a carbon Tzibur. Zok Gemara, Ba Le Toida. Toida has its own chumrah, Shekin Tu'una Lachem. So you can't bring a rye from Toida. But Dr. Gemara, Oilu Shlomim Yechichu, V'chazar Din. Now let's bring a rye from all three together. Loy Roizeh Karoizeh, V'loy Roizeh Karoizeh. Shlomim has its own chumrah, Oil has its own chumrah, Toida has its own chumrah, but they don't share the same chumrah. The only thing that they share in common with all three of them is Hatzara Shavish Ben, Shein Kachim, V'shachton Shaloi Shmon Kasher, Ve'in Maratza. So let's extend that to Asham as well. Afani Avi Asham, Shu Kodesh, V'shachton Shaloi Shma, Kasher, Ve'in Maratza. These three items do have one thing in common that is not shared with Asham. Each one of these karbanos are brought voluntarily. Asham is brought because you're obliged to, because you did an Aveira. Ella Amar Rava, we have to find another Makar. It's Zois HaTorah we're going to go back to the same default limud that compares all karbanos to each other. Ikishu akasav l'shlamim. All other karbanos are compared to shlamim, including an osham. Ma shlamim shen kachim v'shtaklin shaloilish one ksherin mit maratin afani avi osham shu kodesh. So the Lamaskona, Reish Lakish's question is, why is an osham not compared to a chatos? I not marata. The teretz is because it's included in the hekesh to shlamim. Frek Gemara, who said you're makish osham to shlamim? You know what else is in that parsha? Chatos. So machos is the akshus l'shlamim, akish l'chatos. Compare it to chatos and say the osham is not going to be a good carbon. Gemara, you can't do that. We've already established Hamid Rechmana Isa. The tzul of Shaloi Lishma applies exclusively to a chatos because that's what the pasuk said. So once you know that the osham cannot be compared to the chatos, so when you're going to put it into this hekesh, you're going to be makish it the shlamim, and just like shlamim, Shaloi Lishma is a kosher carbon, but it's not meratza, that will be the same deal with an osham. Debating. Yosef Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, Yosef Rav Sheshes Kabai. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman was sitting, and Rav Sheshes was there. Yosef the Kamri, and they said, Kasha Leila Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish had a problem. So they're all having a secondary discussion about what Reish Lakish said. Kasha Leila Reish Lakish, Osam, the Asr La'achamisa, his question was that you don't bring an Osham La'achamisa. Right? That was his whole problem. Since Oila, you bring La'achamisa. You saw that the Oila of Oila that you bring La'achamisa. So therefore, it makes sense that you could bring it in Snamaratza. But an Osham, you never find an Osham is brought La'achamisa. Right? That was Reish Lakish's original kasha. So they asked, what are you talking about? I'm going to show you where you do bring an Osham La'achamisa. Leimalei Rabbi Lazar, Osham Nami Osar La'achamisa. Rabbi Lazar could have told Reish Lakish, your kasha doesn't even start. Because you do bring an Osham La'achamisa. How is that? Amul Rav Sheshes, Osham L'mai Karev, L'moisrei. Yes, you'll bring Osham La'achamisa. Because you know why you bring an Osham La'achamisa? Because what's the halacha if the owner of an Osham dies? You don't kill the animal. It's not like a chatos. You know what you do with it? It's yirachi yistoyev. So it's going to go into the pasture. It's going to get a mum. And then you're going to sell it. And what are you going to bring with the money? A carbon. So you see the Osham, not the actual cow, not the actual animal, but the Osham itself is still going to have kedusha v'haraya. It's going to have to be used as a carbon. So you see, even lachamisa, you can bring an Osham. But that's not a kasha. Because chatas nami mikriv karva moishra chatas. A chatas also, you will bring its extra as a chatas. Now you're going to ask me, what do you mean? Chatos, shemesa by law, you don't sell, you kill the animal. So where do you have an example of a chatos that's extra that you bring it? Very simple. The case is as follows, Rashi. What if someone owed a chatos and he was the type of person that wanted a plan A and a plan B. He was a careful type of guy. So he was mafresh two karbanos. And he said, this carbon A is my chatos. But should something happen to carbon A, then I want carbon B to be chatos. So what happens if he brings carbon A and then the carbon B is not a carbon anymore. But if carbon A will not work out, then you bring carbon B. So Rashi tells us in an interesting scenario, you'll have a case where you could bring this la'achar misa. How do you have that? Zokt Rashi. Let's see Rashi inside. He explains the case very nicely. Chatas nami Moshe Davu kagoyin here for shtei lachrayis. He was mavrish two karbonis plan A and plan B. Mischaper ba'achas mehen v'shni atira. The halacha is the second animal doesn't lose its kedusha. If he uses the first animal as planned, the second animal we say is tirat sheyistoyer. Vahi kreva lachem is vital. So that's exactly what happened. Someone was mavrish two karbonis, and he brought A as a carbon. B now, the halach is it's tirat sheyistoyer, and you could bring it, and you buy a carbon with it. So that's exactly this case over here. Alma osachat is lachamisa, because here, even after the person dies, his children will still sell that animal and buy another animal with it and bring it as a carbon. So you cannot claim that that's a reason why an osham should be able to be brought and not maratza, because we know chatos, which is pasal shaloi lishma, also has that possibility. There's a big difference. Chatos afal gav de karva moisra, even though the extra chatos after the owner dies will still be brought, but miet rachmanahu. There's still a gzeres hakosa. Dafka the chatos has to be done the shema, but not the other carbon. Frank Gemara, but you know what? I have a pasuk by Asham too. Asham namik siv bei who? Where does it say who by Asham? So it says it in the following pasuk. The hikter oisa makayin hamizbecha ishal Hashem Asham hu. Now I just want to point out a distinction between the miyat that we're quoting now by Asham to the miyat that we quoted earlier for chatas. It says v'shachad oisa b'mkoy masher yishchad es ha'olah lefnei Hashem chatos hu. So it says chatos hu by chatos, and it says Asham hu by oila. I am sorry. It says over here midrachmanahu, which says chatos hu, but Asham nami ksiv behu. So let me take that back. That distinction. Zok the Gemara, hahu la'acher haktaras emurim. The distinction is because when it says who by chatos, it's talking about where by the smicha before the shchita. Before the shchita, that's chatos hu. Yes, that's where when you're doing the avodas, that's where it has to be lishma. But look where it says oshamu. It says it after the haktaras emurim. It's all over. The party's over already. So saying the word who after the whole party's over doesn't teach us anything. The Brisa tells us that the word who is not mentioned by Asham during the processing of the carbon, rather only after the party's over, and who, so it's referring to Aktara, and even Aktara Gufa doesn't have to be Lishma. You know why Aktara doesn't have to be Lishma? Because you don't have to do Aktara at all. A carbon noshim, if you will not makter the imurim, it's still kosher. So you can't say it has to be Lishma. You don't even have to do it at all. Ve'elahu lama li. So what is the who? What is the who by Osham telling us? Lichad Rafuna Marav. Dam Rafuna Marav. Osham shanitek l're'iyah. V'shachta istam kosher. Now, we know what are you supposed to do by an Osham if it's Mesu by Leah? You're supposed to let it pasture, graze, until it gets a mum. Once it gets a mum, you sell it, and then you buy another carbon, and with that other carbon, you're makav on the mizbeach. But the animal itself, the Osham itself, you're not going to be makav on the mizbeach. However, what happens if Bez and Paskin, the man died, and they said that we have this extra Osham, what should we do? And Bez and Paskin, what do you mean? You're actually staying. Put it in the meadow. And then you brought it as a carbon. You're not supposed to bring it as a carbon, but you brought it as a carbon. Once it's a nitek, once Bezin already said, okay, this is designated to be sold, even if you brought it as a carbon, it will be a kosher carbon. That doesn't mean that's what you're supposed to do, but it's still a kosher carbon. So therefore, kosher. But nitek in, loy nitek loy. That's only Bezin already formally said, you gotta shut this down. My time on Makrahu, the Osham will still remain. Okay, let's stop here because it's 6:35 and it's 5 minutes to Slichas. So we're almost a blot ahead.